So thanks everyone for joining us. We are having this really interesting experience today that's quite meta. We're interviewing Marc, Ryan, and James, who are currently in England, but we're doing it from here in San Francisco, which I have to say out loud to situate myself. But what we're actually talking about is kind of distance collaboration, so it's quite perfect. But I just want to start off by just setting a little bit of context. So we're at Gray Area in San Francisco, and the last time I was here was on the stage was in 2019 when I gave a talk at the first Algorithmic Art Assembly event. And so I want to thank Thorsten for setting this whole thing up, and I want to thank Gray Area for continuing to exist. I think myself of Gray Area, along with the lab and the Center for New Music, is really, for me, focal points for the city's activity. So being here is interesting. Just at the risk of getting emotional, this is the first cultural event I've attended inside since March of 2020, maybe even since February, because I came back from New York from a trip and have done very little since. In fact, I had a ponytail until about a week ago. That's how little I've done. So I just want to introduce Marc, Ryan, and James. So Marc Fell is a musician, multidisciplinary artist, and producer whose work has persistently challenged the boundaries between dance music and academic computer music practices. I've been listening to him since the mid to late 1990s, and Marc was part of a community of musicians at the time who really helped situate my head toward certain types of electronic music, so I can now pay him a debt of thanks for that direction. Rian Treanor reimagines the intersection of club culture, experimental art, and computer music, presenting an insightful and compelling musical world of fractured and interlocking components. The two of them worked in collaboration with James Bradbury, who's up there in the corner. James Bradbury is a creative coder from Perth, Australia, now also living in England. Together, the three of them built a web audio-based collaborative synth engine, which is the subject of our conversation today. It's called Intersymmetric, and it's available at intersymmetric.xyz. I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. We've got till about 1:50. I don't actually have a view of the clock because of the screen, so I can keep that view over here. And I want to start off just by asking you to help the audience understand how this web audio tool came to be. I have a few questions that are tailored for each of you, but a few of them are more general, so whoever wants to field that first one.
Maybe you could answer the first one, Ryan.
Okay. What was the question again? How did it come to be?
Yeah.
Well, we started doing these kind of multiplayer patches basically over lockdown, which was a response to isolation and obviously not being able to work with people in the same room. So it was like, yeah, just a kind of exercise that we were trying to overcome is just like, oh, how can we make a max patch that multiple people can play together? And when we got to that point, it was like, oh, it opened up a lot of other potential things for either remote performances or workshops or participatory kind of networked systems for doing stuff together. But the main issue that came out of that is, well, I was doing workshops with little kids and like, she's like, oh, we've made this stuff that's like, that people can work, join together and make stuff with. It's like, oh, but now I'm trying to get a 10-year-old kid to download a max patch and install software, and there's just all of the boundaries. So like, can we get to a point where we can do this just all in the browser, that we can send a link to anyone and they can use it without really much hassle, which turned into like a lot of work for us three.
A lot of work for James.
Yeah.
But also we should say that it was also kind of response to streaming, that when lockdown happened, we were getting asked to do loads of streaming events, and it just felt like a really unsatisfying sort of thing to do. So it was like, we want to find an alternative to streaming. And so that was part of it, I guess.
Yeah, I found that really fascinating. So the audience understands, the crew was invited repeatedly at the start of the pandemic when streaming was really taking off to, as I understand, to perform, which a lot of people were doing. But my understanding is your sense was, that's not really a particularly rewarding thing for you personally. And I know a number of musicians kind of struggled with it and came up with other solutions. But your solution, to me, is a marvel, because a lot of those online experiences didn't allow the performers to interact with the audiences at all, but you kind of turned inside out the way that you would ever interact with a musician, an audience member, by putting them in the position of the performer. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, using this web-based system, there is no kind of distinction between the performer and the audience. Like, anyone who's logged on could suddenly grab a dial and disrupt things, so which will probably happen. And I think it was like we just wanted to get away from that. You know, like, it just felt wrong to be like, yeah, just the whole way streaming works. It just was like completely awful, like the worst possible way to perform music that I could think of.
Well, one in terms of audio quality, weren't you? So it was like we could make something that we stream from here to there, but actually the thing that I think we were more interested in is how can you connect computers together so like the audio can be generated locally, which is then a higher definition, or I don't know, you know what I mean, better quality. Mm-hmm. But all we're doing is sharing patterns. So it's like basically very low amounts of data, which it then is also quite low latency as well. But that simple thing ended up opening up like lots of other potentials for like, remote collaborations, or we could do multi-channel stuff or things that multiple people could work together on. And that was the kind of interesting things that came out of it. But then when there are multiple people involved, that sort of brings up other questions about authorship, or who's the performer, who's the audience, all this kind of stuff that's quite unusual, which there's
so much web audio out there that involves interaction, but it is the fact that people can do it simultaneously, and how you mediate their distance, that's really what pushes it well beyond anything I'd seen before it.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising that no one's explored it before, but it seems like, you know, there's loads of multiplayer games where you can go around a virtual city killing each other, but there isn't anything like a drum machine. Well, now there is, because we did it. But, you know, it's like this, why hasn't that happened? It just seemed like we were a bit surprised that it didn't exist before.
Yeah, it's like so basic, isn't it? Multiplayer drum machine. I think it's got a lot to do with, though, the computer is like a sole user interface, isn't it? It's like there's one X and Y pad, and how do you open that out? Obviously, like internet and networked, it's really for it. But why, like there's Google Docs, or there's even ones for like kind of like drawing tools and stuff like that. But there wasn't really many things for music anyway. There were a few bits, to be fair.
Yeah, I reviewed a couple of online concerts during the pandemic. So I was reviewing concerts for the first time on the very same device I was experiencing the concert, which was quite kind of a humorous thing at first. The first one was sort of unique because it was pretty early on. I think it was April. The second time made sense because it was a live coding event. So it made sense in the context. But yours, it's entirely different situation. I think the only live streaming event that really struck me as native to live streaming was when Leslie Flanagan did one where she performed in a space but wore headphones. So she made careful that she was hearing exactly what the audience was hearing, and there was no, you were mentioning before when we were all setting up, the echo you were hearing. The echo is the space we're in. It's this three-dimensional space, but it's also this layering of three-dimensional spaces where your three rooms and this one are combined. She's the one person I think who really kind of bridged that gap in a performance way, but the work you're doing with Intrasymmetric is interesting. Can you talk to me about how it came to be through No Bounds? Because my understanding is that it became the result of a commission from a festival, correct?
Well, what happened was that, so Liam, who runs No Bounds, is a friend of ours. You know, we live just down the road, I guess. By American standards, we're like next door neighbours, but we're about half an hour away. And he was like, the festival, you know, he was having a difficult time because lockdown had just killed his, you know, no one had adapted to this new way of working, and the funding wasn't there and stuff. And he was like, you know, he was having a bad time, and we'd been developing this max patch system to share, you know, to synchronize max patches remotely. And there was no funding, I think. I can't remember, Ryan, but there was a very, very small amount of cash And I was like, and we were like, oh God, this is going to be a massive pain in the arse to do this. It's so much work. And I was like, let's just do it. Like, when Forge Masters made the first record on Warp Records, they didn't wait for a £10,000 Arts Council grant. They just did it. And I just thought, this is the time to do it. So let's just do it. We're not going to be making money out of it. But so we did. I think you did a version, didn't you, Ryan, just using Max patches and did a performance?
Well, we worked on the core thing of like linking two Max patches together, but then I'd used that to make a kind of drum machine around it that I used with a group of kids to do a remote performance, basically. So they were like a group of 10-year-old kids, all in their homes, dotted around UK. Well, mostly in Rotherham, actually.
It was so funny as well because it was tea time. Tea time in England means like evening meal. Like it doesn't mean anything to do with drinking tea or whatever with the Queen.
Dinner time.
Tea time is like evening meal. So it's like basically the performance at No Bounds coincided with tea time.
Yeah,
so
but
you've got like these 10 kids on screen and the mums are in the background shouting, saying, you've got to go and have your food.
Because there were a delay with like, oh, we're all there waiting for an hour about to perform, and it's like, no, there's another delay, and they all had to like go off and have food. Like, oh, my granny's turned up. But then yeah, it got to a point we performed remotely and presented this live thing that was streamed. Well, that was played back in a venue, actually multi-channel, like 24 speakers or something. So they were all controlling it in real time remotely. There was a small audience. And we're like, okay, that was the kind of first hurdle to be like, that's possible. But like I said, the issue of getting kids to download patches, all this stuff, and then there's like issues around like verbal communication. Obviously, if you're sharing something together, you can't speak to each other. So we had this chat room function in it with the kids, but none of them made any music. They were just all like typing emojis and stuff, and the parents like, you should delete this. So that was
So we deleted the chat room facility.
Yeah.
Delete the chat room is a good name for like political movement, I think.
So when did James join the picture? When did this transfer to James occur?
Yeah, so that was like...
Let James answer, he's not spoken yet.
No, but I'm just going to say that was 2020, that first piece, but then from that we're like, okay, it works. Let's try and develop it into this online version, which we got some cash for. Well, Liam commissioned us to do it, and that's when we were in touch with James about, yeah, how do you do this?
How hard was the transfer, James?
Sorry, what was that?
How hard was the transfer from the Max MSP to the web-based process?
Well, me, Marc, and Ryan had a sort of brief call, and we spoke about the general idea, but we didn't actually at that point exchange any kind of like sound-making code or anything like that. And so I was really interested in this idea, and I like the kind of the puzzle of it, the technical challenge, and I just started off making something really small, like a slider that wiggles on two screens in the browser, and just kind of exploded from there. So I want to say that it seemed really easy if you stayed zoomed in, like on a week-to-week time scale, but overall the whole thing exploded in time, and it really took like, I want to say like a year to reach the final thing, and it really came along incrementally rather than like in an instantaneous sort of translation of a Max patch. It was very much like an iterative process between us all.
Now, there's a new version of it which you've created for this festival, correct? It's a new commission.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
What was the creative process? What were you, well, for one thing I noticed, having played with it a little bit, is that the interface I found, and everyone here will see it soon, the interface I found to be less literal. I felt I had to, could you talk about how the new interface came to be? I see nodding, that's a good start.
Well, we were aware that like, hopefully like the vast majority of the people who will be at this event are like on a similar place to us in the nerd spectrum. So it's like the fact that it's not literal is like, for us, an interesting thing, because it's, that's part of what draws us into it. So, the first one was like, that's for kind of kids who just want to make techno, and which is brilliant, and that was why it had that kind of simplicity and sort of like... It was
commissioned by No Bounds, who do club, it's like a dance music context, so that's why, yeah, it was a drum machine, but for this algorithmic arts assembly, it made sense to do something more.
Algorithmic. But also the way of making it seems that we really kind of got to grips with like how to develop it, I guess. So we kind of made a max patch and then found a way of more or less translating that one-to-one. Well, James found a way of doing it. So that really simplified the process. The fact that we could make it in max and say, here it is. And James's way of getting it online was pretty...
And the new version works on phones, which the previous one didn't, correct? Was that a goal, or was that just a happenstance through the production?
It was a goal, but I think doing it was just good luck.
It was a bit of both, wasn't it?
Well, the interface as well in the no bounds version was kind of much harder to think about how it would work on a small device, because you've got like the 16 steps and 16 by 6 grid. Like, what do you do when suddenly your screen is like this big and portrait? Like, those questions start to become very difficult to answer and time consuming, whereas this one is a little more abstract and kind of, again, luckily the interface that Rian and Marc proposed to me already had a kind of affordance to be rearranged in a portrait mode and a landscape mode. So
yeah, but the grid thing, you could just have it so if your phone turned on the side, it just have it so you force the user to have it in landscape mode. In reality is we didn't get round to figuring out how to get it working on an iPhone.
Well, for the first one, we were using a different type of process, weren't we, in terms of code? And then this one, it's a very different way of working, which ended up it worked on. But maybe you should speak more about that, James.
Well, yeah, I mean, we had this sort of very treacherous back and forth of like, here's a max patch with some parameters, and we like these presets and how we can get from this preset to that preset. Then I'd scratch my head and put it in the browser using a library called Tone.js. But then, if we wanted to test it, I then had to make all of the parameters of these synthesizers available to Marc and Rian. And so what they ended up with is like this really sort of the bit that you see now, and then, about 10 screens worth of dials and sliders. And then they'd have to go and, tweak the settings and say, actually, it's a little bit different under these circumstances. What's gone wrong? Doing all sorts of debugging, like looking at signals and curves for ages, trying to find, this low pass filter is slightly different in the browser than what it says it is. Whereas now in this more recent version, we're almost directly using Max code in the browser, using Gen. And so the process was literally like, here's the synthesis, and I would just go, yep, and now it's done, basically.
So where is the synthesis occurring?
Do you mean like in terms of how do people on the other end get their sound? Or
yeah, like is the sound originating in my browser itself, or is it on a server somewhere?
It's your computer generating it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And this is an incredibly naive question, but does the browser I'm using in any way influence that? Does the computational power of my laptop in any way inform the sound we're hearing?
Under certain circumstances, it'll degrade, maybe.
Ooh, that might be fun to
hopefully it sounds the same. But
yeah, like an older computer, a less specified computer will crash.
Yeah.
Before a more powerful one.
I'll put that to a test this weekend.
But different browsers do work differently, don't they? Like, they don't really change the sound so much, but I know, for instance, it works really well in Chrome, but I tried it on my computer using Brave, and that doesn't really work for some reason, whereas it works on my phone using Brave. It's a whole kettle of fish, basically, isn't it, using different browsers and all that kind of stuff. But
we've done every permutation and combination to try and test it, which is fun.
Speaking of testing, Ryan, I understand you did the first version you tested with children. Did you do that again this time?
Well, the thing that the one that we made for No Bounds, which is the online grid, the drum machine one, I've used that in loads of workshops, and that was the main reason to build it. Is like, how can we make an accessible software that kids can use together, and can I help facilitate that, or like. Yeah, basically the tool, the online thing was basically a way to connect people. So it's like yeah, like that is the actually. But through that, I've been trying to figure out loads of like interesting ways that you can sort of make rules that people follow, or what kinds of interactions can people have other than just going crazy. But what ended up happening is the less you say, the better. And when there's like 20 people on it just doing whatever and going like mental, that actually is what sounds better. But for this one, I've noticed it's different, and because it's more algorithmic, there's more generative stuff happening within the structure itself. It's like it seems like a bit more hands off kind of ends up sounding better, whereas the other one was more static. It was like the more you do to it, the more I don't know, the more fun it sounds, I guess. But it definitely I don't think I ever heard anyone make like a straight sort of track with it. It was just always like all over the place.
And we would always like come back to the synth, you know, weirdly we'd go and check it and someone had put like a single square in, you know, in like a completely weirdly named room, but it would sound amazing because they'd done something really interesting with the way the patterns would step, or it was at like 300 BPM. You know, people would find all these like really weird edge cases because they'd be sitting there, you know, with their friends or with 10 other people, just kind of like mashing the controls of this thing and really finding where it breaks down.
Yeah, James, you bring up something interesting. I hadn't really thought about it this way, but I was thinking about other forms of online musical collaboration that involve latency, that play with latency and make something of it. And there aren't a ton that came to mind. One is Eric Whittaker's Choir. I think that's an interesting example of using latency as a kind of halo. You're just taking advantage of it rather than having it take advantage of you. And another is Ninjam, which is sort of an online collaborative. But the thing about both of those is that they're meaningless by yourself. You don't play Ninjam by yourself. And Eric Whittaker's Choir would be worthless if there was just him alone. But the thing that's cool about your tool is I can just play with it by myself, right? I can just sort of fiddle alone. How did the latency come? When did you kind of come to grips with the latency? I'm going to try to describe it in a moment, but I was wondering what your experience of the latency was like.
Well, it's pretty instant, isn't it? I mean, I didn't think there was much latency.
I'm going to say it's a similar latency to what we're going through now. It's just like slight, but because the sounds are generated locally and the patterns are generated locally, all we're doing is sharing control parameters. It actually doesn't. There might be a latency of like a second or a few milliseconds. It's way less than a second. It is just a few milliseconds.
It's a few milliseconds.
Yeah.
So when you're playing it, it actually is like you don't notice.
Yeah, what I found is I can recognize it when I'm in the same room as someone. But when they move to another room, we mentioned that we did a little test conversation before this, but we've never spoken in depth about this topic till now. Yeah, I had experience. I have a daughter, she's 11, and I showed it to her, and she thought that was cool. And we played it in our computers side by side, and it sounded weird because it was sort of slightly off. And she just said, hold on one second. She just got up. She's the one who thought of this, got up and moved to another room, and suddenly it sounded perfect. And we then had this very interesting conversation about how our experience of it was different because it was off, but when we were separate from each other, we didn't know about the difference, and the beat is what really keeps us in step with each other. It's a fascinating solution.
But actually, that's not an issue to do with latency. That's just an issue to do with when you press play.
We tried so hard to press play at the same time.
Yeah. You know, like you could just be at different points in the pattern, sort of.
Yeah.
But yeah, it makes sense when you're in different spaces, doesn't it? When you're together, it's not connected by like MIDI or something, but there is room to do something like that. But yeah, we didn't. But yeah, when you were saying, oh yeah, we had to sit in other rooms, we're like, no, that wasn't our plan. We wanted to make something that connected people.
You tore my family apart, man.
Everyone out.
So I want to switch gears and talk a little bit more about the commission aspect of this. So this idea that an event would commission code that then lives online but also is experienced in a space such as this one, that's interesting to me. And I was wondering, had you been commissioned previously, Marc, or anyone, to do code for an event prior to this?
Well, I've been commissioned to make works, you know, so, and some of those might be permanent works. So there was no difference, you know, it was just like, yeah, this is what you get for your money, basically, this thing that exists online.
And do you think of the code, like, do you think of the result of this, the intersymmetric, as being equivalent to an album, equivalent to a song, or is it a distinct entity?
I don't really think of like that whole thing of like where the value is it in the process or the outcome? That is a kind of dichotomy that I've just learned to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like I just don't like. I think that people used to ask this all the time. Like, are you? Because I'm a Max programmer and I make albums. Like, okay, so where is the work? What is the important bit for you?
Yeah.
Is it making the process and the album's just a documentation of that, or vice versa? And I think that dichotomy just comes out of a worldview that I want to not keep referring to. Do you know what I mean? Of like, it's basically a teleological kind of system, a teleological worldview of like, everything is a means to an end, and at some point you have the end that makes everything else justified.
I love this term, the character of a system, that I heard in an interview with you on this topic, where you talked about you weren't interested in the end result, the music, the system, that fine-tuning that was what was of interest. This is sort of related to that?
Yeah, but you know, I do like making records, and you can be interested in both. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like there's I guess anyone who does code, like Ryan's younger sister, my daughter, just started to learn Python at university, and growing up as a kid, she's like, Dad, I do not want to learn this stupid Max MSP software that you keep trying to get me to learn. I'm not doing it. And then like she phoned me up, she's like, Dad, I've been learning Python. It's like completely amazing. And I knew she'd love it, because just the whole way, you know, if you're dealing with code, how you can build things and make them slot together and like make them more efficient, or, you know, make them go from a messy state to a neat state. You know, just there's a special kind of pleasure in that, I think. So yeah, that is something I think we all probably get.
By sharing this tool online, are you helping people get in touch with that interactive, are they getting closer to the code than they might just by listening?
I don't know. I mean, they'll have a different experience of it, I guess, and they'll be able to get a sense of what happens when they move this dial, what that does to, you know, they might not be able to quantify it in terms of, oh yeah, it's this kind of Markov chain or whatever, and da-da-da. But, you know, you get a feeling for what's happening, I think.
I want to ask a question about how this is all being experienced differently by people because of the pandemic, but by definition, this wouldn't even exist without the pandemic because you created it within the pandemic. But I was wondering what you think about how drum machine culture, dance culture, club culture will change as we slowly emerge from this, and how the bridge to these online activities will I don't want to think of it as a dichotomy, but will live events occur always simultaneously with virtual ones?
I guess sometimes that will happen and sometimes it won't, you know. Like, I think there's always something nice about getting together in a space and hearing music in the space, you know, and that's, nothing can really be a substitute for that, I think. So this isn't aiming to replace that. It's just aiming to create something different. Do you know what I mean? It's not trying to copy that.
No.
If you know what I mean. And that's the thing about streaming. Streaming was just like, it's just a really bad copy of what it's like to go to the theatre or something, and you're hearing the performers there. And, you know, when a new technology comes along, it's not just about copying the form that previously existed. It's like about working out what the new technology makes possible, I think.
Yeah, streaming concerts were like a facsimile, whereas what you did was I don't know if you reverse engineered to fit the circumstance or if it was just a moment of realization. How did you come up with the solution? Like, did you try 5 other things and then this finally worked, or was it a natural conclusion of a thought process?
Well, how did we come up with
the original Max MSP one?
Well, I was working at a university in Karlsruhe in Germany, but I was based in Rotherham, you know, in Britain. And I was trying to figure out like what to do with students. So I think a lot of the thoughts about remote collaboration sort of came out of that. And actually the first kind of
version
version of the Max patch, a student of mine, Kim In Han, who was at Karlsruhe, wrote a bit of did the kind of interact, the bit that synchronized it.
Well, he was making something where he wanted machines communicate, send a message between, and he was asking you for your advice.
Right, yeah.
And you asked a bunch of people at Max, like,
yeah. So it was this student was like, he was doing its installation. So it was like about 10 computers in one room, and he was like, I'm synchronizing it by listening to some chat Twitter feed or something. And I'm like, this is crazy, because you could only send a certain amount of characters in the Twitter feed. So I think I emailed Joshua Kit Clayton and said, look, I've got a student who's really stuck. And Josh was like, have a look at Socket.io. And so I passed that on to Kim In, and he's like, oh yeah, this has solved it. And then I was like, we can use that to do performances remotely.
No, but then we got a load of help from people at Max, didn't we? Like, they were like quite helpful in like, oh, there's actually an issue here. You can resolve this like this. And
yeah, the people at Cycling 74 were brilliant. It was just like, and it's kind of weird for us because we're stuck away in the north of England, and it's like we think of that kind of community. It's almost like the kind of motherland or something. Like, whoa, this is like the sacred place of all these like amazing people that whose names we see on emails and things. And to have them helping us, it was like, whoa, that's really brilliant.
Yeah, I think we may take it for granted a bit here in San Francisco. I had a job on a street not far from here many years ago, and I got to work the first day, and it was on an alley, and I looked across the street, and the Cycling 74 office was across the street from this new job I just started. There's a density of that activity here that's not everywhere.
Yeah, well, it's definitely not here.
Well, we have a lot of people here listening in. It's sort of awkward that I don't think you have any sense of the crowd, but I would like to give them the opportunity to ask some of the questions I've been trying to ask as well. So I want to pass it on now. Thorsten's got the microphone, and he's going to pass it around. But thank you for your time, gentlemen.
Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thanks.
Anyone got a question for Marc, Ryan, James? Any hands, volunteers? Oh, maybe less. Oh, there we go.
Hi, guys. I want to ask about this difference between making a Max patch, which is itself sort of the composition, versus making software within which you compose. And when you make something that you are designing for other people to use, you have to think more about the design of the software so that it's intelligible to this other person. In particular, I think I noticed that the way in which you're sort of constraining the parameters of the synthesis algorithm, you're making a lot of choices about, well, what does this turning this one knob do to these pages of parameters that James mentioned? So is this process of making software for other people different from how you normally work, or not? And how do you think about kind of the difference between those two approaches to making work in Max?
Marc, did you guys hear that okay? Or Marc, do you need to repeat that? Yeah. Heard it.
I heard it all right.
Yeah,
like I think from the beginning we're clear that we're not trying to make general purpose tools. It's almost like we're kind of making a composition or a compositional system, and the people who use it are engaging in that, are performing that composition almost. If we're going to use very traditional terms like composition
or structure,
yeah.
But one thing is that lots of your patches or my patches, they tend to be quite simplified in terms of what you use to play with. I think in a performance environment, it's kind of good to have not 1,000,001 parameters. So you're just working with a few things. So that's how do you construct that in a way that has a kind of dynamic relationship with the sound that you're doing? But then it really ties in. I feel that ties in quite well to working with people who are not necessarily professional or people that are beginners, because it's this higher level processors that really anyone can pick up and play. Because I can't play musical instruments, I just twiddle dials, and make the system constrained in a way that hopefully it can't go wrong. It's like,
We also have a lot of discussions about the interface, like what it looks like, what the ranges of parameters are, like
yeah,
you know, when you turn this one, should this one adapt? Or like it's never a case of like, this is the instrument and this is how it's going to be. We kind of go through this back and forth process of thinking about what might be musically expansive for people to explore at the same time as also thinking about where it's not just like a black box where you move something and nothing happens, or you can't trace your effect through the system. So,
but also I had a really similar conversation with S, who designed the digitone for Electron. I don't know if you know that little module, the digitone. And I was like, knowing FM synthesis like I do, from the DX stuff and also from having conversations with Chowning and stuff, like just what FM synthesis is. What you get on the digitone is something that, there's a lot of like, one dial does a lot, and there's a lot of constraints around what it can do. And like this guy S who designed it was like, well, that's the fun of making instruments, and I think that's kind of part of what Ryan?
like the instrument maker has to define those like constraints, and you don't make an instrument that can do every single thing. So like the instrument maker's job is how do you boil it down into a structure that's like usable really, or like people friendly, I guess.
But also just like the distinction between an instrument and a composition, like there are systems-based compositions. And for me, what I'm interested in is how complexity is a product of simplicity, rather than building very complex systems for people to use. I'm like, reduce the system to make it ultra simple and then see the complexity that emerges from that. And I just find that more interesting, I guess. That's, that ticks my box. But I guess that's reflected in how we've done this.
Do you receive data from the program and witness sort of user habits? Are you aware of which knobs have been hit the most and which have been used not at all?
Yeah, and we sell it all to like people, mega corporations, and we're making millions of pounds doing it. It's fantastic.
But my question is, can you fine tune the instrument over time by being like, wow, no one ever touched these?
It all gets streamed to Vladimir Putin's private bunker.
Machine learning.
No, we don't. I mean, we can track how many users we've had and where and stuff like that, but we don't collect any sort of data.
Mm-hmm.
But we're thinking about doing like other iterations. So it's maybe like the first one was a drum machine. This is more algorithmic, but then we're planning other stuff where it might be more about networks between people. And then if there are possibilities of like storing certain bits of data or configurations, and then how they can kind of be recalled at different times. There's loads of like scope for all that stuff. But yeah, not in this one.
We're working on a new one. I don't know if we're allowed to announce it, Ryan. Are we allowed to?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, we won't announce the new one. One after this is going to be is interesting.
More questions? I have one as well, actually. From when you've actually experienced other people playing it in a larger group, what surprises have come from that? Are there any sweet spots? Like, have you had too many people playing, or talk to that experience?
Yeah. One thing that's really weird is spending so long making a system basically on your own or with a few people, and then you're like, okay, it behaves in this way, and then you put it online and you see other people on it at once, like, actually, no, it's a whole different kettle of fish. It's different. It has a certain character to it, and obviously, it depends who's playing. But generally speaking, it's like it has a similar thing where it's just quite chaotic and like not as difficult.
Having said that, I remember when we launched the first one, I was like just listening to something, like listening to what people were doing. And it sounded amazing. And I was like, Ryan, there's someone on this doing something totally brilliant. And then it turned out to be someone quite famous. I forgot the name of the person, but I think he tweeted saying he'd just been using it or something. But
yeah, there were a few times you can.
Sorry.
Were you saying something, James?
Yeah, so I was going to say, like, occasionally I would go and just find ridiculously cool little settings that I'd never even imagined were possible. And, I'd record it and then someone will come in and press random. It was gone forever.
Yeah.
I didn't want a random button. Whose idea was the random button?
We'll all blame
I
each
think
other.
you just put that in, James, just because you thought of it.
No, it can be good, but yeah, sometimes you can see, just like not through talking, but you can see someone's like quite focused and detailed in what choices they're making, and then and other times people just like, oh, speed to the lowest, speed to the highest, and just do. Actually, that was probably me, to be honest. I was just like doing all this sort of like interfering with people.
I've taken a bunch of screenshots, but I did learn what the clear button does the hard way, so I started the screenshots after learning what the clear button does. So. Well, this has been really cool. If there's any other questions, we have another one.
Another example of group participation in a musical endeavor is bands or orchestras or things like that. And those often benefit from forms of, in the form of orchestra, a conductor, or even small bands. You know, James Brown is sitting there cueing people off and so forth. And is there any thought or any sort of affordance to allowing that sort of synchronization by humans, you know, one of the people or a group of the people sort of signaling to each other, okay, we're about to go into this section, and it's in 3 and 2 and now.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is interesting about maybe, or what we were interested in this type of thing is breaking those kind of hierarchies down. But how can you embed those sort of structural cues or things within in an interface or within the system itself? How can you embed things that make people respond to each other in certain ways? So just really basic, simple little rules that you might give to people, like you make a change when your screen is this color, or don't make a change. Yeah, and like, well, actually, we're going to do a performance tomorrow with some of the artists from San Francisco and some of the artists in Barcelona, and we're going to do this like big multiplayer thing. And part of that is each player is going to have a rule of make a change and then wait 60 seconds to make another change, and hopefully that'll like. But yeah, I guess maybe you got some things to say about that kind of hierarchy in terms of ownership or composer and player and all that. There's big thing in it. And
I think for me, just like my musical prejudices are that I don't like music that has those dramatic changes. You know, if I'm listening to a piece of music and it suddenly switches from one behavior to a very, you know, a clearly synchronized different behavior, for me personally, I don't enjoy that in music. Like, I just like music that just goes on and kind of never really changes in character. And I think that comes from like the way I listen to music. So I grew up listening to records, and I just like put the needle down and just skip through a record as a way of kind of like understanding what the piece was. Do you know what I mean? And I think, I don't know why, but all my favorite records are records that, you know, they might be completely chaotic and stuff, but they just kind of hover on one level. And if I have a record that suddenly has a kind of narrative change in it, I don't know why, but I don't enjoy that. So that's not for me the kind of, that's just basically my prejudice. That's not for me the kind of thing I'd want to build into a thing of like, how do we synchronize everyone to make a specific change at a certain time? But if someone else wants to do that, then that's up to them. We could bring back the chat room, actually. That's what we should do. Bring back the chat room that we just deleted. Have you got anything to say about that, James?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, like, but I think also at the same time, Ryan's right that the kind of unspoken motivation that we had for this and going forward and trying this new iteration out of the system was that organization emerges rather than is dictated by someone, and that is something that is a product of how the system is designed to look and how the controls feel and how they interact with the sound synthesis. I mean, I'd be kind of I was interested actually, and I suggested it, and we talked about it, like the idea of like disabling controls if people touch them. So it's like, you've done something, now you have to wait
the control
could run
just
wild.
moves wherever your mouse is. The control moves like.
Slides to the left.
I guess that for me though is the real interesting thing, is how you can use this type of thing of like networked people. Like what can you explore within that, and like how can you use this musical structure or this tool, whether it be like, how can you use that to form interesting connections or relationships, but not exactly like friendships, more like I don't know, people.
I also got into this idea of like ambient togetherness, and like, you know, a lot of the way you interact with people online, it's very determinate, and it's always about, you know, we're having this Zoom meeting, or there's this chat room where we're talking, or we've got to work on this document. It's all very determinate. But, you know, in real life, in the outside world, it's like you might just be sitting on a platform and there's some person like 5 meters away from you. And there's a kind of like, or when you're just in the waiting room with someone, and it changes the dynamic of the space. And I've came up with this idea of like ambient togetherness, that you don't really, you know, you're not really communicating, but you are occupying the same space somehow. And I just like the idea of like how that might be in this kind of system, that you just see someone, you know, just doing something and disappearing or whatever.
Unfortunately, I think our time for ambient togetherness is about to fade because we've reached the time, but I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to engage with you long distance on this. So there's more to come. They're going to now perform some of this. So I'm going to leave the stage, but leave it to you. So thank you so much, and thanks, everyone.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. So we'll switch over to the Intersymmetric website and see you guys on there in a minute.
Okay.
I'll leave it actually up on the chat if you're there until. Let's get the link up.